Thank you. Well, thank you first of all to you and the university for hosting me today for this event. And let me also say that I'm really looking forward to the discussion because I come with a lot of knowledge about different things, but the last thing I am is really a specialist on, Africa or your country. So it's really for me also a learning experience. Why am I here? It's really to explore opportunities for working with South Africa, partnering with South Africa when, hopefully we will be both on the Security Council in 2019 and 2020. Now, let me link back to what was said by Elizabeth in her opening. Indeed, when we look at the world today, then we see a world which is increasingly complex. It is dominated by many crises, quite a bit of them in our direct neighborhood when we look at the Middle East or, of course, also Northern Africa. But we also see global challenges of a different nature, cross-border, such as climate change, environmental pollution, droughts as a consequence of that, and changes in the environment. Or we also see, of course, challenges coming from terrorism and violent extremism, which again is a global phenomenon which we all face as well as at home and and abroad. And of course, from our analysis, we also have to recognize that many of these phenomena are actually interlinked, so that sometimes conflicts are fueled by lack of resources or scarce resources or climate change. Then, of course, you can also look towards, migration, and then you again find that conflicts and armed and confrontation are, of course, among the triggers also for refugee flows and migration, and so on. So it's very complex. Another aspect of today's world that troubles us in Berlin is that I think for some time we kind of took the rules-based international order with the United Nations as its key pillar for granted. I mean, we all knew that it has sometimes weaknesses, and sometimes we wanted to act more decisively. But basically, we thought that this is the kind of international order which is there to stay, and the more we interact with it, the more we can strengthen it. Today, I think, though, that we have to recognize that there are tendencies. Both in Europe, beyond Europe, in other regions, across the Atlantic, tendencies really to turn back and to say, it's about our national interests. We want to, as far as we can, we want to govern everything within these national confines, and international cooperation or the broader public good and the global commons. That's really not for us, to look at. And it goes together with also many instances where international rules and the international law actually is not being respected. We can deepen that conversation if you wish. To give you an example, use of chemical weapons. I think 10 years ago we might have thought that's a thing of the past, but unfortunately it is not. And so on balance, we have to say that multilateralism in the United Nations has seen better times. I actually do remember them in the 90s with the big world conferences. And therefore, today, actually, it is about can we, make the United Nations fit for purpose under today's conditions? Can we come together as the global community in order to govern and solve many of the cross-border challenges together? can we come together to implement the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, for example. So against that background, when we look at the globe and we ask ourselves, where are our partners? What alliances can we create in order to strengthen the UN and not lose sight of the strength of multilateralism? And in that regard, we look actually toward what we would also call regional powers, middle powers, because we, as you and some others, actually depend on an order which is rules-based. It's for us a world where it's only about might and military power. It's not one where we would want to live in, and it would also not be beneficial to us. And we also think it's the wrong way to go. So therefore, we think that many others share this sentiment, and so therefore, we actually look towards alliances. And let me say that within the United Nations, Germany has quite a few projects, with partners, especially from the South, with Brazil, with the Philippines, and of course South Africa as well as Germany. We are members of the G20. And so we belong to some formats where we actually already have worked together in the past and actually have also worked together to shape the global international order. Now, I would also argue that both South Africa and Germany, in a sense, are leaders in their regions. Maybe I could also say reluctant leaders, because I think it's true probably for both countries because of history and because of many other factors. But if you look at the economic weight and you look at also the stability, democratic institutions, then I think it's fair to say that certainly, where, both of us engage in their respective regions, that can make a difference also at the global scene. We also, of course, are both engaged in UN peacekeeping operations, especially and many of them on the African continent. To give you an example, South Sudan is one example, DRC certainly was another. So again, we have already engagements within the UN context where we can intensify also our cooperation. Now, with a successful election to the Security Council come responsibilities. And I think when I'm right, then there is a discussion about the Libya case of 2011 here in this society. I certainly can tell you that that was also a very contentious issue in German public and society in parliament. So we know that there is a responsibility when you enter the Security Council. But of course, there's also a tremendous opportunity, because for sure, no one country can solve any of these crises around us alone. And so therefore, in the Security Council, again, the question is, can we bring, the weight and the voice of the non-permanent members of this body? Can we bring that to bear on the kind of challenges which are before us? Let me say that in terms of the German Foreign Ministry, we actually have tried to prepare better for these challenges. So we have had an internal reorganization which actually refocused some of our energies and resources on humanitarian assistance, on stabilization, but also on prevention and mediation. that is because our analysis was that also too often when you have a crisis and a conflict, you see actually cycles of a conflict. So you see a stabilization, but then you also go back into full-fledged confrontation, and many times also into real armed confrontation. So in the German system, we have tried to refocus in order to be better able to respond to crisis situations and to find the right way out into a transition into sustainable peace and sustainable development for the countries concerned. Within that strategy, we actually do see a big role for the Security Council, and that also fits to the agenda of the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres. Quite recently, I went with the German Foreign Minister to a high-level debate in the General Assembly on sustaining peace. And the key idea here, again, is that it is actually much better, it saves lives, if the international community engages in prevention, in crisis prevention, in early problem solving, rather than being forced to send a peacekeeping force by decision of the Security Council. And again, the more we invest in then, stabilizing countries into their way out of such a situation, the better also for everyone. And so we fully support the Secretary General's reform proposals across the board, not only regarding peace and security, but also regarding the development pillar of the UN and also the human rights sector. And overall, we are convinced that we have to also start making these linkages in order to better reflect the complexity of today's world. And so in that sense, that will be also a task on the Security Council to make sure that we look at this not only through a narrow peace and security lens, but we take into account issues of sustainable development, of climate and security, of human rights and security, as well as questions of peace building. And so that's what we certainly also would like to support during our turn. Now, let me end again on this essential, also purpose of my visit here in Pretoria and Johannesburg, because it's really also in exploring. Where do these German interests intersect with the kind of objectives or ambitions that South Africa might have, and where can we best also relate to each other in the United Nations and in the Security Council especially. And I think I would like to end here to give also space for questions and answers and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.